Imagine this. You're sitting in front of a steaming bowl of noodles when your chopsticks suddenly hit the floor. You glance around. No spoon. No fork. Nothing clean enough to fish the noodles out. You try using your fingers, but the noodles slip away, and the broth is so hot that your hand jerks back the instant you touch it. It's a ridiculous little problem, but it raises a much bigger question. How did ancient humans eat hot food? Did they simply wait for it to cool, burn their fingers and deal with it, or invent another solution entirely? But here's the strange part. If eating utensils have existed for thousands of years, why does every child still have to learn how to use them? And why did different cultures settle on completely different tools? Maybe utensils are more than a dining habit. Maybe they are connected to the way the human brain and body evolved. To see how much a simple eating tool can reshape society, jump ahead to 17th century France. At aristocratic banquets, the knives on the table were not used only for slicing meat. When conversation turned hostile, they could become weapons. The solution was wonderfully human. Instead of stopping the arguments, they redesigned the knives. King Louis XIV ordered pointed table knives to be blunted in an effort to reduce violent confrontations. Over time, the rounded dinner knife emerged, separating the eating utensil from its older role as a weapon. That harmless-looking knife beside your plate still carries the memory of an era when dinner could end like a sword fight. But when it comes to ancient humans, the misunderstanding runs even deeper. We often assume they used tools simply because tools were convenient. The truth is that humans may be biologically incapable of thriving without them. We have unusually large brains, yet our teeth, jaws, and chewing muscles are smaller and weaker than those of many other primates. At the same time, the brain makes up only a small fraction of the body's weight while consuming roughly 20% of its energy. So, how do you fuel such an expensive organ without spending every waking hour chewing? Our ancestors found an extraordinary answer. They began processing food outside the body. Watch a chimpanzee eat, and you begin to understand the problem. A chimp can spend as many as 6 hours a day chewing tough, fibrous food. Nearly half of its active day becomes an unpaid shift for the jaw. Modern humans live very differently. We may spend only a few dozen minutes eating our daily meals, roughly 5% of the day. That sounds ordinary until you consider what those liberated hours made possible. Time once devoted to chewing could now be spent making tools, communicating, learning language, and building increasingly complex societies. Here's where it gets interesting. Millions of years ago, humans began outsourcing part of digestion to technology. Sharp stones, knives, grinding tools, and cooking techniques started functioning like external biological organs, parts of the digestive system located outside the body. Before food ever reaches our mouths, we slice it, crush it, grind it, and soften it. In other words, the first stage of digestion does not begin in the stomach. It begins on a stone surface, beside a fire, in a kitchen, or at the dining table. By doing some of the work in advance, we reduce the burden on our teeth, jaws, and intestines. That journey began more than 2.6 million years ago with sharp-edged stones known as Oldowan tools. Ancient examples discovered in Ethiopia and Kenya date from about 2.6 million to nearly 3 million years ago. Our ancestors struck stones together to create cutting edges, then used them to slice meat and smash bones open for marrow. These were not polished knives with comfortable handles. Most looked like ordinary broken rocks, but in the prehistoric world, one sharp stone edge could unlock an enormous supply of energy hidden inside the bodies of large animals. Before fire became a regular part of human life, these tools acted as stone teeth. They sliced through tough muscle fibers, crushed hard roots, and broke down plants that the natural human jaw struggled to process. Instead of forcing the body to do all the work, our ancestors transferred part of the task to their hands and their tools. It may sound like a minor change in eating technique, but in evolutionary terms, it was a monumental leap. Does that sound exaggerated? Researchers once asked volunteers to chew raw goat meat. The experience was not exactly fine dining. Raw meat behaved almost like chewing gum. Elastic, difficult for human teeth to break apart, and likely to gather into a large lump inside the mouth. Trying to swallow it whole was not a particularly good strategy. But once the meat was sliced into smaller pieces with stone tools, it became easier to chew and exposed more surface area to digestive enzymes. A simple cut accomplished work that human teeth alone could not. By slicing and pounding food, our ancestors may have eliminated as many as 2.5 million chewing cycles every year, while reducing the daily muscular effort of eating by roughly 20%. Think about that for a second. In a world where every calorie mattered, avoiding millions of unnecessary chews offered a major survival advantage. And the energy they saved did not simply disappear. It could be redirected toward an organ that was growing at an extraordinary rate: the human brain. And this is where tools began changing the physical shape of humanity itself. As the demands of chewing declined, the jaw and major chewing muscles, including the temporalis, gradually became smaller across generations. Muscles that once occupied substantial space around the skull no longer needed to be as powerful, potentially giving the skull more room to accommodate an increasingly complex brain. The human face also became flatter, while changes in the throat helped create conditions favorable to spoken language. A sharp stone used to cut meat may have seemed like nothing more than a way to make dinner easier. Yet over immense spans of time, it may have helped shape the brain that thinks, the mouth that tells stories, and the human hand that now reaches for a spoon, fork, or pair of chopsticks. But sharp stones solved only part of the problem. According to a famous idea known as the cooking hypothesis, fire was the ultimate tool that made us human. Professor Richard Wrangham argues that once our ancestors learned to control fire, they did far more than make food taste better. They transformed hard, fibrous, nearly inedible ingredients into sources of nutrition the body could absorb far more easily. Humans became the only species that cooks, and over time, our biology may have become dependent on cooked food. So what actually happens inside a root or tuber when it is placed over a fire? Heat causes its starch granules to swell, burst, and undergo a process called gelatinization. Once that happens, digestive enzymes can reach the chains of sugar much more easily. As a result, cooked food may provide 30 to 50% more usable calories than the same food eaten raw. A hard tuber that once forced the jaw to work for hours can suddenly become a fast, efficient source of energy for the brain. And that is only half the story. Heat also changes the proteins in meat and eggs through a process called denaturation. Tightly folded protein chains begin to loosen and unfold, making it easier for digestive enzymes to break them apart. Experiments suggest that humans absorb roughly 40% more protein from cooked eggs than from raw ones. Fire does not create extra protein. It simply unlocks nutrients that were already there. As food became easier to digest, the human body began to change with it. We no longer needed a massive processing plant inside the abdomen. The human gut is only about 60% as large as scientists would expect in a primate of our body size. A shorter digestive tract may save close to 10% of the body's daily energy use. It was a strange evolutionary trade. Shrink the gut, then spend the savings on the brain. But fire changed more than what entered the stomach. It also changed where humans slept. Before controlled fire, sleeping in trees helped our ancestors stay beyond the reach of predators. A campfire made the ground safer because its light, heat, and smoke discouraged many nocturnal hunters from coming too close. Sleeping on the ground may also have allowed for deeper, more stable rest, which is crucial for memory. And for the first time, human hands no longer had to cling to branches through the night. Now the scene begins to look familiar. A group of people sits around a fire. Food is cooking. Children are watching. Adults are talking. The hearth may have become humanity's first true social center. Cooking encouraged cooperation, food sharing, and new divisions of labor. It also created rules. Who eats first? Who keeps the fire alive? Who divides the food? These may sound like small questions, but they could have helped lay the foundations for trust, fairness, and complex society. Millions of years later, humans entered the Neolithic era. They settled in permanent communities, cultivated grain, and began producing pottery. Clay pots made it possible to cook porridge, broth, and other soft foods. But wait, soft food was not useful only for adults. It helped solve one of the hardest problems any community faces: How do you feed infants who are too young to chew tough food? At archaeological sites in Serbia dating back roughly 8,000 years, researchers discovered tiny spoons carved from cattle bone. They had been carefully shaped from foot bones, with bowls only about 2 centimeters wide. That is unusually small for an adult eating a normal meal, but almost perfectly sized for an infant's mouth. These spoons probably were not made for feasts. They were made for caregiving. Then microscopic analysis revealed something remarkable. The bowls of the spoons were covered with thousands of tiny dents and scratches that matched marks left by baby teeth. The damage was concentrated exactly where a child would bite or suck while being fed. This was no longer a guess based only on shape. It was direct evidence that prehistoric humans used utensils to feed soft food to young children. That tiny spoon may have had consequences far larger than its size suggests. Before soft weaning foods became available, children often had to breastfeed until they were old enough to chew tougher foods. Grain porridge mixed with animal milk allowed them to be weaned earlier, sometimes shortening the process from several years to only a matter of months. Mothers could regain fertility sooner. And a small tool made from bone began changing not just the way children ate, but the rate at which human populations could grow. And this is where the tiny spoon began producing enormous consequences. Once infants could eat porridge earlier, mothers no longer had to provide all of their nourishment alone for years. Other members of the community could help feed them. The time between pregnancies grew shorter, and farming villages began filling with children at a much faster rate. Researchers call this the Neolithic demographic transition. A utensil, only a few centimeters long, helped create larger communities, which eventually opened the way for towns, cities, and entire civilizations. But history has a habit of sending the bill after every invention. The new diet of porridge, milk, and starch helped children grow, but it also introduced a familiar enemy: tooth decay. Compared with children from hunter-gatherer societies, Neolithic children developed cavities far more often. Soft, sticky grain porridge clung to the teeth, where bacteria converted its starches into acid. The spoon made food easier to eat, while the food inside it quietly damaged the teeth doing the eating. Convenience and trouble often arrive together. Humans have always been remarkably good at inventing both. As farming communities spread, eating utensils did not follow a single evolutionary path. They branched out according to the crops people grew and the ways those foods were prepared. In the West, wheat and barley were often baked into bread or served in large pieces that needed to be cut. In East Asia, rice and smaller grains encouraged a very different style of eating. The tools placed on a table were not simply expressions of etiquette. They were miniature maps of climate, agriculture, and the resources available in each region. In East Asia, one practical problem may have encouraged the rise of chopsticks. Firewood was scarce. To conserve fuel, cooks sliced meat and vegetables into small pieces that could cook quickly. Once everything had already been cut in the kitchen, there was little reason to bring a large knife to the table. Small sticks, first used to retrieve food from hot cooking pots, gradually became the main utensils for eating. In other words, chopsticks may not have begun as symbols of elegance. They may have begun because no one wanted to burn through an entire pile of firewood just to make dinner. Then a practical tool acquired a philosophical meaning. Confucius supported the use of chopsticks because knives evoked warfare, killing, and the slaughterhouse. In his view, a cultivated person should not place a symbol of violence directly in front of themselves during a meal. That idea helped establish chopsticks as the central dining utensils in many cultures influenced by Chinese traditions. What may have started as a fuel-saving solution eventually became a symbol of peace and refinement. While chopsticks gained respect in the East, the fork had a far more difficult beginning in the West. Personal forks appeared in the Byzantine Empire, but when they reached other parts of Europe, many people considered them strange, extravagant, and even sinister. Medieval diners were perfectly comfortable eating with their fingers and knives. Someone carefully lifting food with a tiny fork might have looked as though they were trying far too hard to impress everyone at the table. It sounds like a joke, except it actually happened. The story became even stranger in the 11th century, when a Byzantine princess brought forks to Italy. Some members of the clergy objected, arguing that God had already given humans fingers and that replacing them with a metal instrument was an act of arrogance. When the princess later died from illness, her death was even interpreted by some as divine punishment. The fork did not merely have to prove that it was useful. It had to survive centuries of religious suspicion and social prejudice. So what finally saved the fork? Not philosophy, not science. Expensive clothing. European aristocrats wore elaborate garments with long sleeves and delicate lace that could easily be stained with grease and sauce. Eating with your hands was a terrible strategy when your outfit was worth as much as another family's entire property. The fork kept food away from both fingers and fabric. By the 18th century, it had gradually become a symbol of cleanliness, elegance, and social status. Sociologist Norbert Elias argued that this story was not really just about utensils. It reflected what he called the civilizing process. As societies became larger and more complex, people had to learn to control behaviors that had once seemed perfectly natural. The way you held a knife, brought food to your mouth, or sat beside other diners became a test of discipline. Rules first imposed by society gradually turned into an inner voice, reminding you how a proper person was supposed to behave. The dining table became a small stage where people learned to hide the instincts society labeled animal. Chew with your mouth closed. Do not make noise. Hold the knife and fork in the correct hands. These rules did more than keep meals orderly. They also created boundaries between social classes. A person who handled utensils correctly appeared educated and refined. Someone who made a mistake could be judged as crude or uncivilized. But here is the deeper point. Utensils did not only help humans control food. Over time, they also helped society control humans. Once those rules moved inside people's minds, something strange happened. In earlier times, a guest might have worried about being attacked at the dinner table with a knife or club. But as society became more stable, the fear of violence gradually gave way to the fear of embarrassment. Hold your fork the wrong way, chew too loudly, or spill food, and no one has to punish you. A few disapproving glances are usually enough. People begin monitoring themselves through the imagined judgment of everyone around them. But while table manners were becoming more refined, the utensils themselves could still kill people quietly. Pewter tableware became popular because it was cheap and easy to cast. The problem was that some older pewter alloys contained as much as 40% lead. When vinegar, fruit, or other acidic foods touched the surface, lead could dissolve into the meal and pass directly into the body. A perfectly ordinary dinner might contain a dose of poison that no one could see, smell, or taste. Here, history produced an almost comical paradox. Wealthy families using silver and poor families using wood may sometimes have been safer than the middle class eating from pewter. Silver has natural antimicrobial properties, while wooden utensils do not leach heavy metals into food. So the phrase "born with a silver spoon in your mouth" may have implied more than wealth. It could also have meant a better chance of staying healthy. Sometimes social status was sitting right there in the spoon you lifted to your lips. It was not until the early 20th century that stainless steel solved many of these problems. With chromium and nickel in the alloy, stainless steel resisted corrosion, rarely rusted, reacted far less with food, and did not leave behind an unpleasant metallic taste. More importantly, it was easy to clean and could be mass-produced. For the first time, durable, hygienic, relatively safe cutlery was no longer reserved for the wealthy. Of course, humans rarely stop improving something just because it already works. Today, we have the spork, part spoon and part fork, and the nork, a fork with an edge designed to cut food. These hybrid tools were made for fast meals, camping trips, and people who preferred doing everything with one hand. It may sound a little lazy, but the history of utensils has always been about reducing effort. First, we saved millions of chewing motions. Now we are saving ourselves the trouble of switching tools. Yet beneath the polished surface of modern cutlery lie the marks of millions of years of evolution. Our teeth, jaw muscles, and digestive systems were all shaped by food that had already been sliced, crushed, softened, and cooked. Technology did not remain outside the human body. It pushed back against our biology, gradually adapting us to a world built around fire and tools. Look at your own teeth. They are dramatically smaller than those of our distant ancestors by as much as roughly 80% in some comparisons, and our digestive tract is also considerably shorter than that of many other primates. Once food became softer and easier to process, the body parts responsible for breaking it down no longer needed to remain so large. The human body became lighter and more energy efficient, but also more dependent. That was part of the biological price of supporting a large brain. And this is where the story becomes slightly unsettling. Modern humans depend deeply on external energy and technology. We would struggle to survive for long by chewing raw food in the wild the way other animals do. We need fire to soften it, knives to cut it, pots to cook it, and an entire cultural system to turn ingredients into meals. Utensils do not merely make eating more convenient. They are part of our survival machinery. But that evolutionary story is not over. Every time you manipulate chopsticks, turn a fork, or lift a spoon to your mouth, the joints in your fingers and neurons in your brain must coordinate with remarkable precision. Children still have to learn these movements because they are not entirely instinctive. Culture continues training the hands, behavior, and manners of every new generation. In that sense, each meal is also a small daily exercise in skill and self-control. In the end, humans are more than hunters or gatherers. We are the cooking apes, creatures shaped by fire and tools. Fire unlocked energy. Stone blades eliminated millions of chews. Spoons helped feed infants. Chopsticks and forks helped create distinct cultural worlds. So the next time you pick up an ordinary spoon, think about what you are really doing. You are not simply eating. You are repeating an action that helped turn your ancestors into human beings.